Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm Dr. Erika Lucas, and I'm so glad you're here. I'm a public educator entering my 16th year of teaching. I'm also a researcher and the founder of BrainBlocks, an educational publishing and professional learning brand built around one central mission: helping educators teach the way the brain learns. For more than 15 years, I've worked with children across elementary, middle, and high school classrooms. And throughout that time, I kept encountering students who were clearly capable, but who could not always access that capability when learning became difficult. They understood the lesson, but could not get started. They knew the expectation, but acted before they could stop themselves. They had strategies, but could not reach for them when they became frustrated. And they knew they wanted to succeed, but did not always know what their brain needed in order to move forward. Those students and experiences stayed with me. They shaped my classroom practice, became part of the questions I explored through my doctoral research, and ultimately led me to create BrainBlocks. BrainBlocks is built on a simple belief: children should not have to wait until they are struggling to be taught how to navigate struggle. We explicitly teach children how to read, write, calculate, and solve problems, but we often expect them to start, focus, regulate, adapt, persist, and ask for help without giving those skills the same clear language, modeling, and practice. BrainBlocks was created to help make those invisible skills visible and to give educators and children a shared language of learning for when the moments when learning gets hard. In this free masterclass, we're going to explore the hidden gap between what children know and what they can consistently access. We'll look at executive function, motivation, cognitive demand, and the assumptions we sometimes make when capable kids get stuck. This is not about diagnosing students. It is not about excusing behavior or lowering expectations. It is about becoming more precise in the way we observe, interpret, and respond. As you listen, I'd like you to keep one or a few of those kinds of students in mind. The kids whose strengths you can clearly see, but whose struggles you have never quite been able to explain. At the end, I'll introduce you to the Recognizing Executive Function Observation Guide, a simple, free tool you can use to begin looking at that student or those students through a new lens. You do not need to leave today knowing everything about executive function, but my hope is that you leave asking a better question. Instead of, why won't this child do what I know they can do? You may begin to wonder, where is this child getting stuck? And what might their brain need next? So let's begin. I want to start by telling you about a student I'm going to call Emma. Emma is bright, curious, capable. Yesterday, she solved problems just like the ones sitting in front of her today. And she knows the math. And right now, she's staring at a blank page. Her pencil is on the floor. Again. She's sharpened it twice. She asked to go to the bathroom. She reorganized the crayons in her desk. And 15 minutes into independent work, Emma hasn't written a single thing. What's going on? This is the moment where adults start making interpretations. Maybe she's avoiding the work. Maybe she's unmotivated. Maybe she isn't trying. Maybe she's being defiant. Maybe she just needs to apply herself. But here's the problem. Every one of those explanations begins with the assumption that because Emma knows how to do the math, she should also know how to make herself begin doing the math. Those are not the same cognitive demand. We tend to think about learning in terms of what a child knows. Can she read the words? Can he solve the problem? Do they understand the concept? But knowing something and being able to access that knowledge when you need it are different things. To complete the worksheet in front of her, Emma doesn't just need math skills. She needs to start. She needs to hold directions in her mind. She needs to resist distractions. She needs to manage frustration. She needs to notice if her first strategy isn't working. She needs to try something else. And if she's still stuck, she needs to know when and how to ask for help. The math problem might be printed on the page, but there are 6 other invisible tasks hiding underneath it. When we hand a child an assignment, we see the assignment, but the child's brain has to navigate an entire invisible curriculum before the assignment ever gets completed. We say, get started, but how? We say, calm down, but how? We say, try something else. What else? We say ask for help. When? From whom? What do I say? We give children's directions that sound like instructions, but often aren't. This may be one of the most frustrating things about executive function, the inconsistency. A child does something beautifully on Monday and can't seem to access the same skill on Tuesday. So we assume, well, I know she can do it. And we're right, she can. But the more important question is, can she access that skill in this moment under these conditions for this task? In my doctoral research, I became deeply interested in this distinction. The literature challenged the idea that executive functions should be understood simply as fixed competencies, a set of skills a child either possesses or doesn't. Instead, researchers have suggested thinking about executive functions as resources that we call upon depending on the situation, with motivation playing a crucial role in whether those resources are successfully recruited. The difficulty of the task matters. The perceived value of the task matters. Emotion matters. Stress matters. Context matters. What else is competing for the brain's resources matters. Inconsistency isn't proof that the struggle isn't real. It may be one of the most important clues that we're actually looking at executive function, or in this case, dysfunction. This is the assumption I keep coming back to in my classroom, my doctoral research, and eventually in the work that became Brain Blocks. We explicitly teach children how to decode words. We explicitly teach them how to regroup. We model how to write a paragraph. We use manipulatives, think alouds, guided practice, visual supports, repetition. And then, when it comes to some of the cognitive skills that determine whether a child can actually access all of that learning, we say, focus, get started, control yourself, be flexible, ask for help. And we assume that the child knows how. During my research, I interviewed students about their experiences with executive function, motivation, and academic challenge. And again, I encountered a striking problem. Students had reached increasingly demanding academic environments without necessarily having had to develop the executive function skills those environments suddenly required. Some describe never really needing to study before, never needing to take notes, never needing to carefully manage their time, never needing to deliberately initiate work that felt difficult. And when the demands finally exceeded the systems they had built or never had to build, they got stuck. My study focused specifically on gifted adolescents, so I want to be careful not to generalize those findings to every child. But it left me with a much bigger educational question. When do we teach children how to learn? Not what to learn, not how to demonstrate what they've learned, but how to manage the brain that has to do the learning. I think we've made an enormous assumption in education. We have assumed that if children are capable of doing something, they should be capable of making themselves do it. If you can read, read. If you know the math, finish it. If you're upset, calm down. If you're stuck, try something else. If you need something, ask. But every one of those actions requires something beneath the academic skill, something that helps the child bridge the gap between I know and I can do, between intention and action, between frustration and recovery, between getting stuck and knowing what to do next. Those hidden skills have a name: executive function. But what exactly does that mean? There are many definitions of executive function in the research literature, and different models organize the component skills in somewhat different ways. But for our purposes as educators, I want to start with something simple. Executive functions are the mental processes that help us turn intention into action. I know what I want to do, and I can make it happen. Think back to Emma. She intends to complete the math page. She knows she is supposed to complete the math page. She may even want to complete the math page, but intention alone doesn't move the pencil. Something has to bridge the gap between knowing and doing. Executive function helps build that bridge. At any given moment, the brain is managing an extraordinary amount of information. What deserves my attention? What do I need to hold in mind? Should I act on this impulse? How am I feeling? Is my strategy working? Do I need to change course? What do I do next? Executive function helps coordinate all of that work, not perfectly, not automatically, and not consistently under every condition. Researchers commonly identify three core executive functions: inhibitory control, working memory, and cognitive flexibility. These core processes support more complex abilities like planning, reasoning, problem solving, emotional regulation, and goal directed behavior. In the classroom, that looks less like a neuroscience textbook and more like this: stop, remember, shift, plan, notice, begin, and keep going. These are not side skills. They are a part of how children access everything we teach. So let's try something. I'm going to give you several shapes. And when you see a circle, the rule is to tap once. You can tap your finger, you can tap your hand, you can tap your foot, depending on where you are. And so when you see a circle, you're going to tap once. And when you see a square, you're going to tap twice. Ready, set, go. Easy enough. Now we're going to switch the rule. Circle means you tap twice. Square means you tap once. Let's try again. Ready, set, go. If I had to guess, many of your hands or fingers just betrayed you. What happened? You had to hold a rule in working memory. You had to inhibit the response you just practiced. And you had to flexibly shift to a new rule: working memory, inhibitory control, cognitive flexibility. Three core executive functions working together. And that was a meaningless game with almost no emotional stakes. Now imagine you're doing it while you're frustrated, or tired, or hungry, or worried that everyone else understands except you, or convinced that getting it wrong means you're stupid. Our brains are remarkable. They're also limited. Working memory, the mental workspace we use to temporarily hold and manipulate information, can only manage so much at once. Imagine it as a workbench. A child is trying to hold the directions, remember the first step, ignore the conversation across the room, think about the math, keep track of where they are, manage the feeling that they're falling behind, and then, in our infinite wisdom, we, as their teacher, walk over and say, remember what I told you 3 minutes ago? You need to finish this, then put it in the blue bin, get your reading folder, and meet me at the carpet. And when the child asks, wait, what am I supposed to do? We sometimes interpret that as not listening. But sometimes the problem isn't that the information never went in. It's that the workspace was already full. Kids start with a mostly empty brain or workspace. And we add a couple of these things: the task, noise, time pressure, fear of being wrong, frustration, a conflict at recess, and the possibility that everyone else is already finished. This workspace becomes increasingly crowded. The same task can require very different amounts of cognitive effort on different days. This helps us understand something we talked about prior: inconsistency. Why can a child do something one day and struggle the next? Because the task isn't the only thing occupying the brain. Noise takes resources. Time pressure can take resources. Frustration takes resources. Fear of failure takes resources. The argument that happened at recess may still be taking resources. The worksheet may be identical to yesterday's. The child may be identical to yesterday's, but the conditions are not. The same task can cost a brain more on Tuesday than it did on Monday. Now we need to talk about one of the most misunderstood words in education: motivation. We often talk about motivation as though it's a character trait. He's motivated, she isn't. They're a hard worker, she doesn't care. But motivation is much more dynamic than that. This was an important thread in my doctoral research. In examining executive function and motivation, I explored research suggesting that motivation plays a crucial role in whether executive function resources are successfully recruited. In other words, the question isn't, does this child have the skill, but it may also be, under what conditions is this child able or willing to recruit the cognitive effort this task requires? What is the perceived value of the task? What is the perceived cost? Is there a meaningful reward? Is there a risk? Has the effort paid off before? Does the child believe effort will matter this time? This doesn't mean that children should only have to do things they find interesting. It doesn't mean that labeling a child unmotivated. It does mean that labeling a child unmotivated tells us almost nothing about what is actually happening. Imagine two students. Both are capable of earning an A. One sees studying as worthwhile because the effort improves the outcome. The other has learned, though, that through experience, studying for 3 hours might change a 92 to a 96. And for that student, cognitive calculation may be, why would I spend 3 hours for 4 points? In my doctoral study of gifted adolescents, some participants described exactly this kind of calculation. One student explained that she knew she could get an A without studying, and that the extra effort simply wasn't worth a few additional points. Others described reaching more demanding courses without ever having needing to study, take notes, or deliberately develop certain academic routines. And again, those findings came from a specific population, gifted kids, and I don't generalize them to every student. But they reveal something important about learning. A skill that has never been needed may have never been built. And when the environment suddenly demands it, what looks like laziness may actually be a missing system. So let's come back to Emma. She's still sitting at the desk, the page is still blank, and from across the classroom, all we can see is one thing: she isn't working. But stuck isn't one thing. Maybe she can't initiate. Maybe her feelings have taken over. Maybe her mind is overloaded. Maybe she's repeating a strategy that isn't working. Maybe she needs help but doesn't know how to ask. Maybe she needs to pause before she can move forward. The visible behavior might look exactly the same. The hidden need might be completely different. And if we misread the need, we may choose the wrong response. We might push a child who needs help getting started, correct a child who needs help regulating, discipline a child who needs help stopping, or rescue a child who needs time to try another strategy. So the question can no longer be simply, why isn't this child doing what I asked? The better question is, where is this child getting stuck, and what might their brain need next? So we're not asking anymore, why isn't this child doing what I asked? We're starting to ask, where's this child getting stuck and what might their brain need next? And that sounds like a small shift, but it isn't, because the first question invites judgment. The second invites curiosity. The first asks us to interpret the child. The second asks us to observe the need. So let's look at Emma again. Page is still blank, still hasn't started, but now we know that not working isn't a diagnosis. It's simply what we can see. Our job is to become curious about what we can't see. Behavior is visible. The cognitive demand underneath often isn't. Once we recognize that a child is stuck, we still have a problem. What do we actually say? Most of us reach for language we've heard and probably used for years. Focus, calm down, get started, think before you act, try something else, and ask for help. None of these directions is inherently wrong. Sometimes the child genuinely does need to focus, or calm down, or start. The problem is that the direction assumes that the child already has a strategy for doing it. If I tell a child to regroup a 2-digit number without ever teaching regrouping, we would call that poor instruction. But we routinely tell children to regulate, initiate, inhibit, shift, and self advocate, and assume that the words themselves are enough. A direction names the destination. Instruction helps build the road. Language gives shape to experience. Before children learn the word frustrated, they may simply know that they feel bad. Before they learn the word denominator, it's just the number on the bottom. And before they have language for getting stuck, their internal experience might sound like, I can't. I'm bad at this. I hate math. I'm stupid. But what if a child could say, I'm having trouble starting? Or my feelings are getting really big? Or I think I need to try another strategy. The challenge is that words like task initiation, inhibitory control, and cognitive flexibility and metacognition are useful for researchers and educators. They're not necessarily the language a 6-year-old can reach for when they're sitting in front of a blank page. So I started asking a question. What if we could make the invisible skills behind learning visible? What if we could take these complex cognitive processes and give children a simple, concrete way to recognize them? Not to oversimplify the science, not to put kids into boxes, and not to suggest that every struggle has one tidy explanation, but to give children a starting point, a shared language, a way to say, something is happening in my brain right now, and I have something I can try. That question became Brain Blocks. Brain Blocks gives children 6 concrete tools for recognizing common moments of getting stuck. The start block helps us begin. The feelings block helps us notice and name what's happening inside us. The stop block helps us pause before acting. The calm block helps us settle a busy body or mind. The flex block helps us change our strategy when something isn't working. And the help block helps us recognize when and how to ask for support. These are not 6 diagnostic categories. They are not a comprehensive model of every executive function, and a child doesn't have one block or lack another. They are child friendly cognitive tools, a shared language designed to help make invisible learning processes easier to notice, name, practice, and use. Because a 6-year-old may not say, I'm experiencing difficulty with task initiation under conditions of increased cognitive load. But they might learn to say, I think this is a start block moment. Giving a skill a name isn't enough. A poster on the wall doesn't build executive function. A cute character doesn't build executive function. And one lesson doesn't build executive function. Skills are built through repeated opportunities to notice, name, practice, celebrate, and apply. First, we notice my body feels fast or my mind feels busy. Then we name. This might be a calm block moment. Then we practice a strategy. Maybe we breathe, move, pause, reduce the input, take a moment. Then we celebrate the awareness and the attempt, not just perfect performance. You notice what your brain needed and tried something. And then we apply it somewhere else. At recess, during math, at home, before bedtime, on the soccer field, or during a test. Because the goal isn't for children to perform brain blocks. The goal is for children to use what they've learned when life gets tough. Once we change what we see, our language begins to change too. Instead of simply correcting the visible behavior, we can begin coaching the thinking underneath it. Instead of just start, we could try, what's one small part you could start with? Instead of calm down, we could try, what is your body telling you right now? Instead of stop doing that, we could try, can we pause before we act? Instead of saying, that's not working, we could try, what new strategy could you try? And instead of, you need to ask me, we could try, what kind of help would move you forward? Notice that coaching doesn't mean removing expectations. It doesn't mean children never have to complete hard tasks. It doesn't mean every behavior is acceptable. And it doesn't mean adults endlessly negotiate. It means that when a child lacks a skill, we teach. When a child needs a scaffold, we scaffold. And as competence grows, we gradually release responsibility. Support and accountability are not opposites. Effective teaching requires both. So again, let's go back to where we started. Emma is staring at the math page. 6 minutes have passed. Before, we might have said, Emma, you need to get started. And remember, Emma already knew that. But now, perhaps we sit beside her, or the paraeducator in our classroom sits beside her and say, this looks like it might be hard to start. What's one small part you could begin with? Maybe Emma doesn't know. So we scaffold. Could you write your name? Done. Could you circle the first problem? Done. Could we read it together? And suddenly, the blank page isn't one enormous demand anymore. We didn't lower the expectation. We lowered the barrier to accessing it. Now, there's an important question we have to ask. If we keep prompting children, won't they become dependent on us? They can if we never release the scaffold, but that's not the goal. The goal is a progression. At first, the adult notices. I see you're staring at the page. Then, the adult helps name. I wonder if this is a start block moment. And over time, the child begins to recognize I'm stuck, and eventually, I need my start block. I'm going to do one small part. The adult voice becomes the child's internal language. That's the goal. Not children who need us to tell them which block to use, but children who can increasingly notice what they need and choose a strategy for themselves. Because executive function isn't about perfect self control. It isn't about compliance, and it isn't about creating children who never struggle. It's about helping children develop the awareness, language, and strategies to know what to do when they do. At the very beginning of our time together, I asked you to think of one or several students. Maybe they're bright and funny and creative. Maybe they can explain the answer out loud, but stare at a blank page when it's time to write. Maybe they know every classroom routine, but somehow forget what they're supposed to be doing. Maybe they fall apart over a tiny mistake. Maybe they call out before you finished asking the question. Maybe they would rather say, I don't care, than risk letting anyone see how much they actually do. I want you to picture that child or those children again. Nothing about that child or children, those children, have changed in the last 40 minutes. Something about the way you see them has. And sometimes seeing differently is where teaching differently begins. So here's my challenge to you. Don't go back tomorrow and don't start the school year and try to fix everything. Don't diagnose, don't label, don't decide which brain block a child needs from across the room. Just notice what happened immediately before the child got stuck. Where specifically did the process break down? What did the child do next? What seemed to help? And what made the task harder? Try to separate what you observe from what you interpret. He stared at the paper for 6 minutes is an observation. He didn't want to work is an interpretation. She tore her paper after making an error is an observation. She was being dramatic is an interpretation. The moment we confuse interpretation with observation, we stop being curious. I've created a simple observation guide to help you do exactly that. This isn't an assessment, it isn't a diagnostic tool, and it isn't designed to put a child into a category. It's a tool for slowing down our thinking. First, what was happening? What was the child actually being asked to do? What did you objectively see or hear? Where might the executive function demand be? And finally, what happened next? What seemed to help? Notice the word might. We are forming hypotheses, not declaring truths about a child's brain. Observe first, wonder second, respond third. I'd like to invite you to try something over the next 5 school days. Choose one student, not necessarily the student with the biggest behavior, not necessarily the student who's struggling most academically. Choose the student you keep finding yourself thinking about, the one you're trying to figure out. On day 1, just notice. On day 2, look for patterns. Does the child get stuck when work is independent? When directions have multiple steps? After transitions? When there's a risk of being wrong? On day 3, get curious. What might the hidden executive function demand be? On day 4, try one small shift. Not an intervention plan, not an overhaul, one shift. Maybe instead of saying, get started, you ask, what's one small part you could start with? And on day 5, reflect. What happened? What changed? What surprised you? The goal isn't to prove that brain blocks works in 5 days. The goal is to practice seeing what's been there all along. We spend a lot of time in education asking how to change children. How do we make them focus? How do we make them more motivated? How do we get them to stop? How do we get them to start? How do we make them more independent? And those aren't always bad questions. Children do need to grow. They need skills. They need expectations. They need opportunities to struggle, practice, and become increasingly independent. But sometimes before we ask a child to change, we need to examine the story we've told ourselves about why they're struggling. Lazy, unmotivated, defiant, careless, doesn't care, won't try. What if instead we became curious? What if we began with the way we see? I want to leave you with this. Executive function is not about creating children who never get distracted, who never feel overwhelmed, who always start immediately, who never act impulsively, who never need help. That's not childhood. And frankly, that's not adulthood either. The goal is to help children begin to recognize I'm stuck. Something is happening in my brain. I can notice it. I can name it. I can try something. Emma may still stare at a blank page tomorrow, but imagine if instead of believing, I can't do this, she could begin to think, I'm having trouble starting. And eventually, I can start with one small part. That's the work. Not eliminating struggle, but building the skills to navigate it. Children don't need to be perfect at learning. They need language for what to do when learning gets tough. And those skills are built the same way all meaningful learning is built. Brick by brick, skills that stick. Thank you for being a brain builder and for listening to this free webinar. I'm Dr. Erika Lucas, and I'm the founder and chief brain builder here at BrainBlocks. You can reach me or contact me at any of the ways below. Through email, hello@brainblocksofficial.com, Instagram @brainblocksofficial, or on the web at www.brainblocksofficial.com. Remember, our mission is helping educators teach the way the brain learns. And if you want to stay connected, scan the QR code to join our Brain Builder community and receive tools, resources, updates, and more. Thanks for watching.